Before we begin, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and stay with us until the end. What you are about to hear is not just history. It is a hidden truth that might reshape how you see faith, Jesus, and your own spiritual path. High on the central plateau of Ethiopia, carved directly into the living rock, stand 11 monolithic churches, sacred structures shrouded in silence and mystery. These are not ruins of the past. They are living testimonies of devotion, carved not just by hand but by faith. For centuries they've drawn pilgrims and seekers from around the world, but beneath the stone, beneath the dust of time, a revelation waited to be unearthed. In recent years, something extraordinary happened. Using artificial intelligence, researchers scanned ancient Ethiopian manuscripts, long preserved by monastic hands. These weren't ordinary scriptures. They belonged to a version of the Bible that the Western world had never fully embraced. The Ethiopian Bible, a spiritual library that includes books, visions, and teachings left out of Roman canon. What they found stunned historians. Hidden among the faded ink and sacred verses were the words of Jesus spoken after his resurrection, words that had remained sealed, untouched by centuries of doctrinal control. This wasn't just an alternative gospel, it was something deeper, a voice from the silence, a guide through the spiritual wilderness. Ethiopian monks had preserved these texts through wars, colonization, and centuries of isolation, not for fame, not for profit, but for truth. Every line was copied with reverence, every page guarded like treasure. For them, these writings weren't simply historical artifacts. They were living messages, carrying the weight of Jesus' final teachings, teachings too precious to be altered or forgotten. These texts tell us that after rising from the dead, Jesus continued to teach, not from a pulpit or throne, but from a place of stillness. He spoke of love that overcomes fear, truth that outlasts power, and faith that is not bound by walls. He warned his followers of a future in which his words would be shouted loudly but lived quietly, distorted by institutions and forgotten in hearts. This was not the Jesus of stained glass windows or marble cathedrals. This was the Jesus who walked beside the forgotten, who taught not with spectacle, but with presence, who reminded us that the temple of God is not made of stone, but lives within the soul. As we journey through this forgotten gospel, we'll uncover a message that speaks directly to the spirit, bypassing ritual and reaching into the heart. A message that may have been buried, but was never silenced. Now let's step deeper into this sacred path and uncover what Jesus truly said after the resurrection. As we cross the threshold into these sacred writings, a new image of Jesus begins to emerge. Not the suffering figure nailed to the cross, but a radiant teacher fully alive, speaking to those he loved most in the days after his resurrection. And one of the most powerful texts that preserves these moments is known in Ethiopia as the Book of the Covenant. Unlike the traditional Gospels, which close the chapter on Jesus once he ascends to heaven, this manuscript keeps the story going. It gives voice to the days in between, those sacred 40 days when, according to Ethiopian belief, Jesus shared truths too profound for the world to yet understand. Not in public squares or courts, but in quiet spaces of trust, he revealed to his disciples the true nature of the kingdom. In the Book of the Covenant, Jesus doesn't come to conquer, punish, or judge. He comes as a divine king, not of thrones and armies, but of the heart and spirit. His kingdom is not built with swords or walls, but with humility, love, and the quiet power of faith. He tells his followers that the mission ahead is not to dominate, but to awaken, not to fight with weapons, but to walk with peace. Expand the kingdom of God, he says, not through force, but through the Spirit. These are not words of strategy. They are words of transformation. He warns that the greatest battle is not out there, in distant lands or among opposing tribes, but within, in the shadows of fear, pride, and doubt that live inside each of us. He reminds them that true faith has no interest in buildings or titles or appearances. Its only foundation is truth. Its only weapon is love. Its only strength is the Spirit itself. But he also offers a sobering prophecy. He tells them that one day many will speak his name, yet ignore his teachings, that people will wear the symbols of his faith, build grand temples in his honor, but forget the essence of his message. There will come a time, he says, when religion will be louder than compassion, when belief will be more about power than presence. And in those times, he says, remember, the true temple is not of stone or gold. It is the soul of a person who listens in silence, who forgives without applause, who prays not for show, but for connection. The Book of the Covenant offers not a call to authority, but a call to remembrance, a remembrance of a Jesus who asked us to serve, not to rule, who taught us to carry light into the dark corners of ourselves and to share that light without fear. Let us now continue, for the next writings hold even deeper warnings and deeper wisdom. As we continue along this hidden path, the tone of the teachings begins to shift. From the warmth of loving guidance, we now enter the realm of warnings. Messages Jesus shared with his followers not out of fear, but out of deep concern for the future of his name, his message, and the souls who would come after him. In these Ethiopian writings, Jesus foresees a time when his teachings would be distorted, hollowed out, and wrapped in appearances. A time when people would loudly proclaim his name from pulpits and platforms, yet walk in ways that betray his heart. He describes a future where faith becomes performance, rituals without reverence, symbols without substance. He says, "They will speak of me in crowds, but forget me in silence. They will wear my cross, but not carry it." These words echo through time, like thunder wrapped in a whisper. What was once a quiet path of humility and service, he warns, could become a system of power used to control rather than to liberate. But amid these warnings, he offers a kind of spiritual compass. True faith, he says, will not shine through grandeur or reputation. It will be found in the quiet courage of those who love when it's hardest, who forgive without applause, who endure without seeking recognition. He tells his followers that the greatest blessing is not found in loud declarations or dramatic gestures, but in the quiet perseverance of those who suffer for the sake of truth, love, and light. He speaks of a future darkness, a time when people will lose their inner connection to the divine, replacing it with doctrines and buildings, forgetting that God's voice still speaks in silence. He warns that lies will be embraced as truth, and entire communities will be torn apart not by enemies, but by their own confusion and spiritual amnesia. And yet, Jesus doesn't leave them in despair. His words, though heavy, carry hope. He says that those who remain faithful, not in name but in spirit, will be deeply blessed. He honors the strength of those who suffer quietly for the sake of love, those who choose honesty over comfort, humility over pride. These are the ones, he says, who carry his true essence forward. The Ethiopian texts tell us that the soul is the real sanctuary, and that faith lived in silence is often stronger than faith spoken in noise. These warnings weren't meant to condemn the future, but to guide it. They weren't shared to instill fear, but to awaken discernment. And so we're left with a question: how do we know if we are walking in truth? The next chapter offers us a vision of Christ rarely spoken of, a mystical teacher who saw the soul not just as sacred, but as a gateway to the divine. Shall we keep going? Stepping further into these hidden teachings, we discover something unexpected, something rarely mentioned in traditional sermons or scripture classes. In the Ethiopian texts, Jesus is not simply a prophet or teacher. He is a mystic, a soul intimately connected with the invisible fabric of existence. He speaks not only to the mind, but to the spirit. His message is not always loud. Sometimes it comes through silence, breath, and stillness. In these writings, Jesus teaches that true prayer is not just spoken with the mouth, it is lived through the body. The movement of the hands, the rhythm of breath, the silence between thoughts, all become sacred when offered with intention. He tells his followers that the soul is the real temple, and that heaven is not a far-off realm, but a reality that can awaken within anyone who listens deeply. Nature is not separate from the divine, he says. The wind is a messenger, the rivers a blessing, the stars a reflection of higher order. Jesus calls the earth Mother and the sun Father. He urges his followers to find God not only in scrolls and rituals, but in the beauty of creation, in the harmony of life itself. This mystical language stands in stark contrast to the rigid dogma that emerged later in Rome. And for that reason, many of these texts were rejected, silenced, or labeled as dangerous. According to the Ethiopian tradition, the Western Church feared what these writings represented, a freedom of spirit that could not be confined within institutional walls. The first reason for this rejection was political. Leaders wanted a single book, a unified message that could be controlled. The Ethiopian scrolls, with their depth and mystery, didn't fit that mold. The second reason was their mystical nature. Visions of angels, unseen realms, and spiritual energies. Such things couldn't be easily regulated. And the third was fear. Fear that if ordinary people read these truths, they might realize they didn't need a priest or hierarchy to reach the divine. They could access it directly, within themselves. Jesus in these texts is not portrayed as a figure of hierarchy, but of liberation. He tells his followers that the light of God lives in every soul, and that each of us carries a divine spark. He encourages them to look inward, to trust their spiritual senses, to awaken from the illusions of this world. It's a radical message, not one of rebellion through violence, but of transformation through presence. And just when you think the message can't go deeper, the next writings take us into even more uncharted territory, a narrative so different that it challenges the very foundation of what most believe about Jesus' final days. Shall we turn the page? As the Ethiopian scrolls continue to unfold, they bring forth a revelation that feels almost too bold to believe. A whisper wrapped in parchment and time, a story told in shadows, preserved not to shock, but to heal. One that tells us, perhaps Jesus was never crucified at all. In these ancient texts, passed hand to hand through monasteries in the mountains of Ethiopia, we find a version of Jesus not as a martyr broken on a cross, but as a living master who quietly walked away from Jerusalem before the darkest hour arrived. He did not escape in fear, he withdrew in purpose. This narrative, known by some as the Ethiopian Gospel of Peace, offers something radically different. It tells us that as chaos swept through the city, as betrayal and politics closed in, Jesus chose the desert over the sword, silence over spectacle, healing over sacrifice. He continued to teach, not from a cross, but from rivers, gardens, and sacred groves. He taught about harmony with nature, about fasting, purification, and the sacred rhythm of life. He urged his followers to care for the earth, to listen to the wind, to honor the body as a vessel of light. He was no longer the wounded lamb. He was the peaceful shepherd. In this vision, salvation doesn't come from death. It comes from how we live, from our ability to love, to forgive, to walk gently upon the world. Jesus appears not as a defeated victim, but as a radiant being who teaches us how to align with the divine by aligning with truth, simplicity, and creation itself. But why has this version of the story remained in the shadows? According to Ethiopian tradition, the early church in Rome had a different agenda. During the Council of Nicaea, centuries after Jesus' time, church leaders selected which texts would define the official version of Christianity. They chose the story of sacrifice and blood, perhaps because it was easier to control a people through guilt than through spiritual freedom. The Ethiopian monks, isolated from Rome, held on to something purer. Their Jesus wasn't nailed to a cross. He was rooted in the earth, speaking to flowers, fasting by rivers, and reminding people that God was already within them. He said, "You are not separated from heaven. You carry it in your breath." This Jesus is not far away. He is not locked in cathedrals. He is with the humble, the silent, the broken-hearted. He lives not in statues, but in every act of compassion, every quiet choice to love instead of harm. And now, as we prepare to close this journey, the final chapter offers not an ending, but a return, a flame that was never extinguished, a Jesus not waiting to come back, but one already awakening inside those willing to listen. Shall we listen? And now we arrive at the heart of it all, not an ending but a beginning, not a tomb but a doorway. If the Ethiopian scriptures have shown us anything, it's that the message of Jesus was never meant to be locked in history. It was never about one moment, one place, or one version. It was about a flame, eternal, quiet, and alive inside each soul. According to these ancient texts, Jesus never truly left. His teachings were not meant to be remembered in marble halls or stained glass, but in hearts that remain soft, in lives lived with purpose and love. He described himself not as a God of distance, but as a light that lives inside the seeker, not the ruler of empires, but the breath in the silence of a humble prayer. He warned that the world would twist his name, that fame, wealth, and hierarchy would replace love, truth, and presence. But even then, even as his message was distorted and sold, it would never die. He said, "My truth is a seed buried deep, waiting for hearts to remember." And perhaps not that time is now. The Ethiopian Bible reminds us that the real temple is not built with stone, but with mercy. That salvation isn't about escape, but awakening. That God doesn't live in towers or books, but in your stillness, in your compassion, in your courage to choose love when the world teaches fear. These texts speak of a fire, not the fire of judgment, but of purification. A divine flame that returns not to punish, but to clear the illusion, to strip away the noise and bring the soul back to clarity. It is not the end of the world, but the end of forgetting. And Jesus, in this vision, does not return with armies, but through the quiet hearts of the forgotten, not through institutions, but through whispers, not through cathedrals, but through broken places, not through power, but through presence. He walks again where no one is looking, in the deserts, in the silence, in the hearts of the poor, the gentle, the misunderstood. Those who still choose truth when no one is watching. Those who still pray not for reward, but to connect. This is the Jesus the Ethiopian monks preserved, not because it was safe, but because it was true. And maybe that's the most sacred part of this story, that in a corner of the world where no empire ruled, the light never went out. It was passed down, page by page, heart by heart. It survived colonizers, councils, and time itself. So now the question becomes yours. Will you carry this light? Will you listen to the voice not shouted but whispered? Will you remember what was never truly forgotten? Because in the end, maybe Jesus didn't come to teach us how to die. Maybe he came to teach us how to live.